The community center on Franklin Street had seen better days. The paint was peeling in the corners, the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired insects, and the linoleum floors carried the scuff marks of 1,000 events. Wedding receptions, birthday parties, retirement celebrations, and memorial services had all passed through those doors over the years. But by 10 o'clock at night, when the last guests had gone home and the caterers had packed up their warming trays, the building fell into a deep silence. That was when he arrived. He was 63 years old, though the lines on his face and the gray in his close-cropped hair made him look older. His name tag read custodial staff, and that was how everyone knew him, the night janitor, the quiet man who came in after everyone else left. He pushed his cart through the empty hallways, stopping at each room to empty trash cans, wipe down tables, and mop the floors until they gleamed under the harsh lights. He had been doing this job for nearly 15 years now. Before that, he worked at a factory that made car parts until it closed down. Before that, he drove a delivery truck. Before that, he did whatever work he could find to keep the bills paid and food on the table. His life had been a series of practical decisions, each one pulling him further away from the person he once thought he would become. Nobody at the community center knew much about him. He was polite but reserved. He said good morning to the day staff when their shifts overlapped, nodded at the event coordinators, and occasionally shared a few words with the security guard who worked the late shift. But he never talked about himself. Never mentioned family or hobbies or dreams. He was just there, reliable as the sunrise, doing his job without complaint. Tonight was a Saturday, which meant there had been a wedding reception in the main banquet hall. He could always tell what kind of event had taken place by what got left behind. Weddings meant confetti in the carpet, half-eaten cake on abandoned plates, and champagne glasses with lipstick stains on the rims. He didn't mind the extra work. There was something peaceful about restoring order to chaos, about taking a messy room and making it clean again. He started in the smaller rooms first, working his way toward the banquet hall. The kitchen staff was still finishing up, their voices echoing faintly through the walls as they loaded the last of the dishes into their van. He took his time, knowing they would be gone soon and the building would be his alone. When he finally pushed through the double doors into the banquet hall, he stopped. The room was dim, lit only by the emergency exit signs and the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the tall windows. Tables were still scattered around the edges of the dance floor, covered in white tablecloths, spotted with wine and cake crumbs. Folding chairs sat at odd angles where guests had pushed them back to dance. Flower arrangements drooped in their vases, their petals starting to fall. But none of that was what caught his attention. In the corner of the room, near the windows, sat a grand piano. He had seen it before, of course. The community center had owned that piano for as long as anyone could remember. It was used occasionally for events, sometimes played by hired musicians or enthusiastic guests who wanted to show off after a few drinks. Most of the time, though, it just sat there, a piece of furniture more than an instrument, covered in a layer of dust that the day staff never quite managed to remove. Tonight, though, something was different. Maybe it was the way the faint light caught the curve of its lid. Maybe it was the stillness of the room, the absence of voices and music and clinking glasses. Or maybe it was something inside him, something that had been quiet for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. He left his cart by the door and walked toward the piano. His footsteps echoed in the empty hall, each one feeling heavier than the last. He hadn't touched a piano in over 40 years. 40 years. The number felt impossible, like a lifetime belonging to someone else. But the math didn't lie. He was 63 now, and he had been 22 the last time he sat down at a keyboard and really played. Back then, he was a different person entirely. A young man with fire in his chest and music in his blood. He had grown up poor on the south side of the city, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a laundromat, and a grandmother who believed in two things above all else: God and education. There was no money for music lessons, no piano in their cramped apartment, nothing but an old radio that played gospel and blues and jazz late into the night. But there was a church 3 blocks away with a piano in the basement, and the pastor's wife noticed the way the boy would linger after Sunday service, staring at the instrument like it held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. She offered to teach him, and he accepted, showing up every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon with homework crammed in his backpack and hunger in his eyes. He learned fast. Faster than anyone she had ever taught, the pastor's wife would say later. His fingers seemed to understand the keys before his mind caught up. By the time he was 16, he was playing for the church choir. By 18, he had won a scholarship to study at a music conservatory downtown, one of only 3 students from his neighborhood to ever receive such an honor. Those were the golden years, the years when everything seemed possible. He studied with professors who had performed in concert halls across the world. He practiced until his fingers ached, until the notes became as natural as breathing. He dreamed of stages and spotlights, of audiences rising to their feet, of a life built around the thing he loved most. But life, as it often does, had other plans. His mother got sick during his final year of school. Not just a little sick, but the kind of sick that doesn't get better, the kind that drains bank accounts and steals sleep and turns every day into a battle. He dropped out 3 months before graduation to take care of her, promising himself it was only temporary, that he would go back and finish once she recovered. She never recovered. After she passed, the bills kept coming. The scholarship was gone, the professors had moved on, and the world didn't wait for grieving young men with broken dreams. He took the first job he could find, then the next, then the next. Years turned into decades. The music faded into memory, a chapter of his life that felt more like a story someone else had told him than something he had actually lived. He hadn't played since the day he left school. Hadn't even let himself think about it, not really. It hurt too much. Like pressing on a bruise that never healed. But now, standing in front of this piano in this empty room, something cracked open inside him. He reached out and touched the fallboard, the wooden cover that protected the keys. It was cool and smooth under his fingers. He lifted it slowly, revealing the black and white keys beneath. They were dusty, some of them yellowed with age, but they were there, waiting. He pulled out the bench and sat down. The room was completely silent now. The kitchen staff had gone, their van pulling away with a rumble that faded into the night. He was alone with the piano, alone with the ghost of the young man he used to be. He placed his hands on the keys. His fingers trembled. Whether from nerves or age or the weight of 40 years of silence, he couldn't say. He took a deep breath, held it for a moment, and then let it out slowly. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed down. A single note rang out into the darkness, clear and pure and impossibly loud in the empty hall. It hung in the air like a question, waiting for an answer, and somewhere deep inside him, something that had been sleeping for a very long time began to wake up. That first note hung in the air for what felt like forever. It filled the empty banquet hall, bouncing off the walls and the high ceiling before slowly fading into silence. He sat there with his finger still pressing down on the key, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that if he lifted his hand, the spell would break, and he would remember all the reasons why he shouldn't be doing this. But he didn't lift his hand. Instead, he pressed another key, then another. The notes came out uncertain at first, like a child learning to walk after being carried for too long. His fingers felt stiff and clumsy, nothing like the fluid instruments they had once been. He hit a wrong note and winced at the sound. Then, another wrong note. His mind knew what he wanted to play, could hear the music perfectly in his head, but his hands had forgotten the path. He almost stopped right there, almost closed the fallboard and walked away. Back to his mop and his cart and his quiet, invisible life. What was he thinking? He was 63 years old, a janitor, a nobody. The young man who had once made professors weep with his playing was gone, buried under decades of factory shifts and delivery routes and mopping floors after other people's parties. But something kept him on that bench. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that refused to let the last ember of who he used to be flicker out without a fight. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. He tried to stop thinking so much, tried to stop judging every note before it even left his fingers. He remembered what his first teacher, the pastor's wife, used to tell him when he got frustrated as a boy. She would put her warm hand on his shoulder and say, "Don't play with your head. Play with your heart. Your hands will follow." He hadn't thought about her in years. She had passed away a long time ago, back when he was still in school. But sitting here now, in this dark room with dust floating in the faint light, he could almost feel her presence beside him, patient, kind, believing in him even when he didn't believe in himself. He let his hands rest on the keys again. This time, he didn't try to play anything specific. He just let his fingers move, following some instinct buried so deep he didn't know it still existed. A few notes here, a chord there. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just sound, just feeling. And then, without any conscious decision, his hands began to play something he recognized. It was a piece by Chopin, a nocturne. He had learned it during his second year at the conservatory, had practiced it so many times that his roommate used to throw pillows at him and beg him to play something else. It was one of the most beautiful pieces ever written for piano, full of longing and sadness, and a strange kind of hope that lived underneath the melancholy like sunlight beneath clouds. The first few measures came out rough. He stumbled over a passage that used to flow from his fingers like water. He paused, went back, tried again. Better this time. Not perfect, but better. His hands were starting to remember. The muscle memory was still there, buried under all those years like seeds waiting for rain. He kept playing. The music grew stronger as he went on, more confident. The wrong notes became fewer, the hesitations shorter. His body began to sway slightly with the rhythm, something he used to do without thinking when he was young. His eyes stayed closed, and behind them he saw flashes of the past. The basement of that old church, sunlight streaming through dusty windows. The practice rooms at the conservatory, cramped and stuffy but filled with possibility. His mother sitting in their tiny living room, eyes closed just like his were now, listening to a recording of the piece he was learning and telling him that one day she would hear him play it for real. She never did. She got sick before he could finish his studies, and after she was gone, he never played for anyone again. Until now. The nocturne reached its climax, a passage of such heartbreaking beauty that he used to practice it over and over just to feel what it did to him inside. His fingers found the notes almost on their own, shaky but true. And then the piece began its slow descent toward the end, the melody growing quieter, softer, like someone whispering a secret they had kept for too long. When the last note faded, he sat in the silence for a long moment. His cheeks were wet. He hadn't realized he was crying. He opened his eyes and stared at his hands resting on the keys. These same hands that pushed mops and emptied trash cans and scrubbed toilets, these same hands that had once made music beautiful enough to earn a scholarship. They were older now, lined with veins and spotted with age, but they still remembered. After everything, they still remembered. He should stop now, he thought. He had already pushed his luck. Someone might come back for something they forgot. The security guard might make his rounds early. He should close the piano and get back to work before anyone discovered him here, lost in a past that didn't belong to his present life. But he couldn't make himself move. Not yet. Instead, His hands found the keys again. This time, he didn't play Chopin. He played something else entirely, something that came from a place even deeper than memory. It was a melody he had written himself, a long time ago. He had composed it during the hardest months of his life, sitting at the old upright piano in his mother's apartment while she slept in the next room, her breathing labored and thin. He never wrote it down, never performed it for anyone. It existed only in his mind and in his fingers, a private conversation between himself and the thing he loved most. He had written it for her. For his mother, a way of saying all the things he didn't have words for. How much he loved her. How grateful he was for every sacrifice she had made. How sorry he was that he couldn't save her, couldn't fix her, couldn't give her the life she deserved after all those years of working herself to the bone so he could have a chance at something better. The melody poured out of him now, rough and raw and imperfect. It wasn't the polished performance of a trained musician, it was something more honest than that. It was grief and love and regret and hope all tangled together, flowing through his fingers and into the keys and out into the empty room where no one could hear. Or so he thought. In the doorway that led to the kitchen, a young woman stood frozen with a tray of dirty champagne glasses in her hands. She was part of the catering crew, had come back to grab the last load of dishes before heading home. She had heard the music from the hallway and followed it to its source, expecting to find one of the wedding guests who had stayed too late. Instead, she found him. The janitor. The quiet old man she had seen 100 times without ever really seeing him. He was hunched over the piano with his eyes closed and tears running down his face, playing music so beautiful it made her chest ache. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She just stood there and listened, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Without thinking, she shifted the glasses to one hand and reached into her pocket with the other. She pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and pressed record. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe she just wanted to remember this moment, to prove to herself later that it had really happened. Maybe she sensed, on some level she couldn't explain, that she was witnessing something important, something that deserved to be seen by more than just her. The red recording light blinked in the darkness as the music played on, and neither of them knew it yet, but everything was about to change. The young woman in the doorway didn't move a muscle. She stood there with her phone held up, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light, recording every note that filled the empty banquet hall. She had worked dozens of events at this community center over the past 2 years, had seen the janitor countless times without ever giving him a second thought. He was just part of the background, like the exit signs and the folding chairs. Someone who cleaned up after everyone else went home. But the man sitting at that piano right now was not the same person she thought she knew. This man was someone else entirely. Someone with a gift so obvious, it made her throat tight just listening to him. The melody he played was unlike anything she had ever heard. It wasn't flashy or complicated. It was simple and sad and somehow hopeful all at the same time. It felt like listening to someone tell a secret they had been carrying for years. She didn't know anything about classical music, couldn't tell Beethoven from Bach if her life depended on it. But she knew what she was hearing was special. She could feel it in her bones. Behind her, she heard footsteps. One of her co-workers, a guy who washed dishes and always complained about his back, appeared at her shoulder. He opened his mouth to say something, but she held up her hand sharply without looking at him. He fell silent, and after a moment, he heard what she was hearing. His eyes went wide. More footsteps came down the hallway, another caterer, then another. Word had spread quickly through the kitchen that something strange was happening in the banquet hall. One by one, they gathered in the doorway, a small crowd of tired workers in stained aprons and comfortable shoes, all of them staring at the old janitor who sat at the grand piano with his eyes closed and tears on his cheeks. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to break the spell. He played on, completely unaware that he had an audience. The music swelled and fell like breathing, like waves on a shore. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. Finding notes he hadn't played in 40 years, remembering patterns his mind had long forgotten, but his hands still knew. The piece he was playing had no name. He had never written it down, never performed it for a single soul. It existed only in this moment, in this room, in the space between his heart and the piano. It was the song he had written for his mother. The song that said everything he never could. And as he played it, he saw her face behind his closed eyes. Not the way she looked at the end, thin and pale and struggling for every breath, but the way she looked when he was a boy, young and strong and full of life, singing along with the radio while she folded laundry, laughing at his jokes, telling him he was going to be somebody someday. She had believed in him so completely. Even when they had nothing, when the electricity got shut off and they ate rice and beans for a week straight, she never let him doubt that he was meant for something more. She worked herself to exhaustion so he could have piano lessons, so he could go to that fancy school downtown, so he could chase a dream that seemed impossible for someone from their neighborhood. And he had let her down. That was the thought that lived in the back of his mind every single day, the weight he carried with him everywhere he went. He had let her down. She gave him everything, and he couldn't even finish what he started. He dropped out. He gave up. He became exactly what everyone expected a kid from the South Side to become. Nothing special. Nobody important. Just another man trying to survive. The music grew heavier as these thoughts poured through him. The melody shifted into something darker, more painful. His fingers pressed harder on the keys, pulling out sounds that echoed the grief he had buried for so long. The people watching from the doorway shifted uncomfortably, some of them wiping their own eyes without knowing why. Then, slowly, the music began to change again. The darkness lifted. The heaviness eased. A new theme emerged from the sorrow, something lighter and warmer. It was like watching the sun come up after a long night. The melody climbed higher, note by note, reaching for something beyond the pain. It wasn't pretending the sadness didn't exist. It was acknowledging it, honoring it, and then gently letting it go. This was the part of the song he had never played before. He had written the sad parts decades ago, in those terrible months when his mother was dying. But this ending, this release, this hope, he was creating it right now, in this moment, without planning or thinking. It was coming from somewhere deep inside him, a place he didn't even know still existed. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "You're going to be somebody someday." And for the first time in 40 years, sitting alone at a dusty piano in an empty banquet hall, he allowed himself to believe that maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe being somebody didn't mean fame or fortune or standing ovations. Maybe it just meant being true to who you really were, even if it took a lifetime to find your way back. The final notes rang out into the silence, soft and clear and full of peace. He held the last chord for a long moment, letting it fade naturally, letting the sound dissolve into the air like morning mist. Then he opened his eyes. For a second, he just sat there, staring at his hands on the keys. He felt empty and full at the same time, wrung out like a towel, but somehow lighter than he had felt in years. He took a shaky breath and lifted his hands from the piano. That was when he heard it. Applause. His head snapped toward the doorway and his heart nearly stopped. At least a dozen people stood there, crowded together in the dim light, clapping and wiping their eyes and staring at him like he was someone they had never seen before. The young woman with the phone, the dishwasher, servers still wearing their black vests, the event coordinator who had stayed late to lock up, even the security guard, a big man with a shaved head who never showed emotion, was standing at the back of the group with something soft and stunned in his expression. He felt the blood rush to his face. His first instinct was to apologize, to explain himself, to make up some excuse for why he was sitting at this piano instead of doing his job. He started to stand, started to stammer out words that didn't make sense. But the event coordinator stepped forward before he could finish. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun. She had worked at the community center for over 20 years and had seen more events than she could count. She thought she had seen everything. She was wrong. She walked toward him slowly, her heels clicking on the floor, and when she reached the piano, she stopped. For a moment, she just looked at him, really looked at him. Maybe for the first time ever. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked quietly. He didn't know what to say. The question was so simple, but the answer was so complicated. 40 years of silence, 40 years of hiding, 40 years of pretending that part of him was dead and buried. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. It was a long time ago. He finally managed. Another life. She nodded slowly, like she understood more than he was saying. Then she pulled out a chair from a nearby table and sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. And so, for the first time in decades, he did. He talked for almost an hour that night. The words came slowly at first, rusty from years of silence, but once they started flowing, he couldn't seem to stop them. He told the event coordinator about growing up poor on the South Side, about the church with the piano in the basement, about the pastor's wife who saw something in him and decided to nurture it. He told her about the scholarship, the conservatory, the professors who said he had real talent. And he told her about his mother, about her getting sick, about dropping out, about the decades that followed, each year pulling him further from the person he once dreamed of becoming. The other staff members had drifted away one by one as the hour grew late, heading home to their families and their beds. But a few stayed behind, listening from nearby tables, pretending to clean up while they absorbed every word of his story. The young woman who had recorded him on her phone sat quietly in the corner, her device now tucked away in her pocket, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finally finished talking, the room was silent. The event coordinator sat back in her chair and shook her head slowly, the way people do when they've heard something they can hardly believe. "All these years," she said softly. "You've been here all these years, and none of us knew." He shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "Nothing to know," he said. "That was a different life, a different person." "No," she said firmly. "That was you. That's still you. What I heard tonight, that doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from who you are." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He just looked down at his hands, the same hands that had surprised him so completely tonight, and wondered if maybe she was right. It was nearly midnight when he finally left the community center. He drove home in his old pickup truck, the engine rattling the way it always did, the streets empty and dark. His small apartment was exactly as he had left it that morning, a worn couch facing a television he rarely watched, a kitchen with dishes in the sink, a bedroom with a mattress on the floor and a photograph of his mother on the nightstand. He lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening in his mind. Part of him felt lighter than he had in years, but another part felt exposed, vulnerable, like a wound that had been covered for so long the air itself stung. He fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning and dreamed of music. The next day was Sunday, his day off. He woke up late, made himself coffee, and settled into his usual routine of doing nothing in particular. He had no idea that while he slept, something had been happening on the other side of town. Something that would change everything. The young woman from the catering crew had gone home that night with his music still ringing in her ears. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. The old janitor, the one nobody ever noticed, sitting at that piano and playing like his heart was breaking and healing at the same time. She had watched the video on her phone at least a dozen times before she finally fell asleep. When she woke up the next morning, she made a decision. She opened her social media app, uploaded the video, and typed a simple caption. "Our janitor just did this. I can't stop crying." She had about 300 followers, mostly friends and family. She expected maybe a few dozen likes, some comments from people she knew. What she did not expect was what actually happened. Within an hour, the video had been shared over 1,000 times. By noon, it had crossed 50,000 views. By evening, it was approaching 500,000. People couldn't get enough of it. The grainy footage, shot from the doorway in low light, showed only his back and his hands moving across the keys. You couldn't see his face clearly, couldn't hear his story, didn't know anything about him, but the music spoke for itself. It reached through the screen and grabbed people by the heart. Comments poured in from all over the world. Strangers wrote about how the video made them cry, how it reminded them of their own lost dreams, how they wished they could hug this man they had never met. People shared their own stories of giving up on something they loved, of getting a second chance, of finding beauty in unexpected places. The video became more than just a clip of a man playing piano. It became a symbol of something bigger. Hope, maybe, or redemption, or the simple truth that it's never too late to remember who you are. Local news stations picked up the story first. A reporter called the community center on Monday morning, asking about the janitor in the video. The event coordinator, who had been watching the numbers climb all weekend with a mixture of amazement and pride, confirmed that, yes, he worked there, and yes, that video was real. By Monday afternoon, news vans were parked outside the community center. By Tuesday, the story had gone national. He found out about all of this in the worst possible way. He showed up for his shift on Monday evening, same as always, and was met in the parking lot by a swarm of reporters with cameras and microphones. They shouted questions at him, asked him to play again, wanted to know his story. He stood there frozen, completely overwhelmed, having no idea what was happening or why. The event coordinator rescued him, ushering him inside through a back door and explaining everything as gently as she could. The video, the views, the whole world wanting to know who he was. He sat in her office for a long time without speaking. His hands were shaking. This was the opposite of everything he wanted. He had spent 40 years being invisible, and now suddenly everyone was looking at him. The thought made him sick to his stomach, but something else was happening too. In the days that followed, as the attention continued to build, something unexpected began to arrive at the community center. Letters, emails, phone calls, messages from people who had seen the video and wanted him to know how much it meant to them. A woman in Ohio wrote that she had watched the video the night before her mother's funeral, and it helped her grieve. A teenager in California said it inspired him to start taking piano lessons again after quitting 3 years ago. A retired music teacher in Florida offered to send him sheet music. A jazz club owner in Detroit asked if he would be interested in performing. And then, one morning, a handwritten letter arrived in a thick envelope with a return address he didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, written in careful cursive by someone who introduced herself as the widow of a concert pianist. She had seen the video online and had been moved to tears. She explained that her husband had passed away the previous year, leaving behind a beautiful restored piano that was now sitting in her living room, unplayed and silent. She wanted to give it to him, free of charge, no strings attached. He read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Then he sat down heavily in a chair and stared at the wall, trying to understand how his life had changed so completely in the span of a single week. He had sat down for a simple tune in an empty room, expecting nothing. And now, somehow, the entire world was watching. The entire world was listening. The entire world was waiting to see what he would do next. And for the first time in 40 years, he didn't know the answer. The weeks that followed were unlike anything he had ever experienced. Offers came in from places he never expected. Television shows wanted interviews. Podcasts wanted his story. A record label reached out about possibly recording an album. A documentary filmmaker asked if she could follow him around with a camera for a few months. The jazz club owner in Detroit called again, this time with a concrete date and a promise of a packed house. He turned most of it down, not because he wasn't grateful, but because it was all too much too fast. He was 63 years old and had spent the last 4 decades living in the shadows. The spotlight felt blinding, uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't fit, but he didn't turn everything down. The piano arrived on a Saturday morning in early spring. A delivery truck pulled up outside his apartment building, and 2 men in work gloves carefully unloaded the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen. It was a vintage upright, restored to perfection, its wood polished to a warm glow that seemed to hold the light. The widow who had sent it had included a note tucked inside the bench. It said simply, "My husband would have wanted someone to play it who understands what music really means. I believe that someone is you." He set it up in the corner of his small living room next to the window where the morning sun came in. For the first few days, he just looked at it, ran his fingers along its surface, sat on the bench without playing a single note. It felt sacred somehow, like something that needed to be approached with respect. When he finally did play, alone in his apartment with no audience and no cameras, it felt like coming home. He started practicing every day, an hour in the morning before work, another hour at night before bed. His fingers grew stronger. The rust fell away. Pieces he thought he had forgotten came back to him, note by note, like old friends returning after a long journey. He bought sheet music for the first time in decades and learned new compositions. He experimented with jazz and blues, styles he had always loved but never had time to explore properly. And somewhere in the middle of all this, he made a decision. The community center had been getting calls for weeks, parents asking if there were piano lessons available, kids from the neighborhood who had seen the video and wanted to learn, teachers wondering if maybe, possibly, the janitor who played that beautiful music might be interested in sharing what he knew. He talked it over with the event coordinator, who by now had become something like a friend. She told him the center had a small budget for community programs. Nothing fancy, but enough to pay a part-time instructor. She asked if he would be interested. He thought about it for a long time. Teaching was different from playing. It meant being responsible for someone else's growth, someone else's dreams. It meant opening himself up in ways he hadn't done in years. The idea scared him, but it also excited him in a way nothing had for a very long time. He said yes. The first class had 6 students, 3 teenagers, 2 younger kids, and 1 middle-aged woman who had always wanted to learn but never had the chance. They met in the same banquet hall where everything had started, gathered around the same grand piano that had changed his life. He was nervous at first, stumbling over his words, unsure how to explain things he had always just felt instinctively. But as the weeks went on, he found his rhythm. He discovered he had a gift for breaking down complicated ideas into simple steps. He learned to be patient when students struggled and to celebrate when they succeeded. He saw the light that came into their eyes when they played their first complete song, and it reminded him of himself as a boy in that church basement, discovering for the first time the magic that lived inside a piano. The program grew. 6 students became 12. 12 became 20. The community center started a waiting list. Local businesses donated money to buy more keyboards so more kids could practice at the same time. A music store offered discounted instruments for students who wanted to continue at home. He still worked as a janitor, but his hours changed. Now he came in during the day, teaching classes in the afternoon and early evening, then staying late to clean up after everyone went home. It was more work than before, longer hours, harder on his aging body, but he had never felt more alive. 6 months after that night in the empty banquet hall, he gave his first public performance in over 40 years. It was a charity concert to raise money for music education in underfunded schools. The event was held at a theater downtown, a beautiful old building with velvet seats and a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. He had walked past this theater 100 times over the years, never imagining he would one day perform on its stage. The house was packed. Every seat was filled. His students sat in the front row, dressed in their best clothes, vibrating with excitement. The young woman who had recorded that first video was there too, sitting near the back with tears already forming in her eyes. The event coordinator sat beside the widow who had given him the piano, the two of them holding hands like old friends. When he walked out onto that stage, the applause was deafening. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The church basement, the conservatory, his mother, the decades of silence, the dusty piano in the empty banquet hall, the video, the letters, the lessons. All of it. He sat down at the grand piano in the center of the stage. The applause faded. The room went silent. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting. He placed his hands on the keys. And then he played. He played the Chopin nocturne that had started it all. He played jazz standards and classical pieces and a few songs he had written himself. And at the end, he played the melody he had composed for his mother, the song that had never had an ending until that night in the community center, when he finally let himself hope again. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause washed over him like a wave, warm and overwhelming. He sat there with his hands still resting on the keys, tears streaming down his face, feeling something he hadn't felt in 40 years. He felt whole. After the concert, a reporter asked him what he wanted people to take away from his story. He thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I guess I want them to know it's not too late," he said slowly. "Whatever dream you gave up on, whatever part of yourself you left behind, it's still there. It's waiting for you. You just have to be brave enough to sit down and try again." He paused, looking out at the crowd still lingering in the lobby, the students and strangers and friends who had all become part of his story. "I sat down for a simple tune," he said quietly. "I never expected anything to happen, but sometimes that's all it takes. One moment, one choice, and everything changes." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that comes from deep inside. "The room transformed that night," he said. "But really, I think I was the one who transformed. The room just helped me remember who I always was."